You do get a little reprieve. So this is a 45-minute session now where you get to hang back a little bit. There's going to be an activity, an exercise at the end of this session. So around in about a half an hour, you'll be asked to do an activity together. But we're going to talk about vulnerability assessments. That's what we're here to do for the next 45 minutes or so. And that's why I said we're going to turn our attention from talking about all the exposures and impacts to talking about how we can turn our attention back to action. So let's talk a little bit about it. And as we get going here, I want another set of reactions, thumbs up, hearts, whatever. If you have begun or completed the process of a vulnerability assessment in your community. I got a heart. I got a clap. All right.
Got an octopus from Lori.
All right. Am I sharing my screen? I am, right?
We're seeing you.
Oh, well. Here we go.
I was just admiring your blouse and the little lace along the collar. It's very cute.
Who, me? Oh, thanks.
You.
I thought that was her descent collar.
Oh. I like it.
Oh, yes, I've heard about that. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. So this is the really good news. Through adaptation, negative health effects can be prevented. So remember in the very beginning of the day, we put you as a human being between flood, fire, drought, all these terrible things in your community. Well, that's a lot to carry, right? But you have this enormous opportunity to come in and bend the course here a little bit. You may not be able to change the climate effects themselves, how the climate is changing, but you can prepare your community in ways that can actually protect people and their lives and their health and their well-being. That's the really amazing news. And that's what I carry in my heart as I do this work, that there's so much potential to make a positive difference here. Now, we're going to talk about the process. We're going to talk about vulnerability assessments as the beginning of a process. So if you have done adaptation planning work, you may know that an adaptation plan is typically kind of looks like this framework that we have in front of you. We've looked at a lot of different examples and best practices around how to do adaptation planning. And really, this is sort of the way it looks. It usually looks like first doing a vulnerability assessment, which is an assessment of all of the various vulnerabilities that may be coming to your community. Once you understand the severity and likelihood of those risks and where you may have gaps in your capacity to adapt, then you can address those vulnerabilities in an adaptation plan, which usually sometimes those two things kind of come together in a report. Sometimes they're two separate reports. We're focused in this conference more specifically on vulnerability assessments, really identifying where the vulnerabilities are. And it's so important because it sets the stage for you to be able to tackle those problems in your adaptation plan with the right strategies where you really need it the most. So getting this right is really important, but you're never going to get it perfect. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you collect this information, how you make these decisions. You'll never have a perfect set of information. You're not going to have perfect predictions about how this is all going to come down to on your community, or perfect knowledge about all the ways that you've got strengths and abilities to adapt. This whole process is about obtaining the information you can to make the best decisions you can sooner rather than later, because it matters. So the adaptation is basically the process of taking actions to reduce or manage risks associated with climate change. And there is not one right way to do it. So if we've learned anything by working with a lot of tribes around the country, you do it all sorts of different ways. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about the different ways that it is being done. And one of the ways that it can be done is really just to build it into other planning processes that already exist. It doesn't not everything about climate change has to be called climate change, especially if you're in a community that doesn't like to talk about the word climate change. So I'm going to talk to you about how this can be incorporated into some other planning approaches as well. And this is really just more of this is like a teaser of why to do a vulnerability assessment. Well, that's because at the end of the day, you can actually develop strategies that really protect people, right? So if you do the vulnerability assessment, you identify those risks, and then you do an adaptation plan where you're coming up with the strategies to address those risks, then at the end of the day, you're going to land on implementing some really good things to protect people. So for example, the Mescalero Apache tribe in New Mexico, they're developing hoop houses and greenhouses with solar power to protect their food and crops. Chickasaw developed a drought contingency plan. Blackfeet has increased its water storage capacity naturally by protecting beavers and restoring riparian areas. The Wainwright in Alaska promote location devices for hunters and travelers who may be at risk of injury or getting lost as a result of permafrost thawing. So this is such a small set of the hundreds of things that you could possibly do to protect health. And it's happening all over the country. And most likely, if you look closely at your own tribe, you'll identify things that you have already done that are already in place. So I mentioned that, there are many ways to do this. It's usually a two-step process. So the middle row is what we just talked about. First, you do a climate vulnerability assessment, then you do a climate adaptation plan. It's through the lens of climate change. You're looking specifically at how the climate is changing, and you're looking specifically at the impacts, and then looking at a plan for addressing all of them. I want to mention that there are other professions and fields that are doing work that this could integrate into, and likely should. So public health, there's a whole public health field that has its own planning approach. However, a lot of tribes don't have these kinds of departments. You might have your own internal public health department like maybe a local government has. But if you do, you might be looking at something like a community health assessment. It's the same thing. We're looking for where are the risks and problems, and then you're going to create a community health improvement plan, which again, it's attaching strategies to the problems and trying to come up with solutions that can be implemented by a community. On the other side, there's a whole emergency management approach. So a lot of the tribes, and I think partially because there's good FEMA hazard mitigation funding out there, have done a lot of emergency management work. Not everybody, but there are some good emergency plans out there, or at least hazard mitigation plans. And so that's typically what the process looks like, right? You're looking at your hazards through a hazard mitigation plan, and then you might have come up with an emergency management plan where you're actually developing strategies and solutions and processes around emergency management to tackle those things that you identified in the hazard mitigation plan. At the end of the day, you're initiating all these new plans and policies or different kinds of actions, and they can all be complementary. And I always tell people, if you're having trouble either identifying the resources or getting the political will to do a climate adaptation plan, you can and should incorporate climate change and those projections of what will happen into some of these other planning processes. But we're going to move forward, assuming that we're actually doing a climate change vulnerability assessment. Part of the reason to do that is really it's a way to really make sure you're looking under all the rocks in the right places so that you can illuminate any blind spots you have about risks that are coming to your community. So we talk about it as a 6-step process, and it's not necessarily linear, and it doesn't necessarily have to be done exactly the way we're talking about. But the processes we have explored generally go roughly in this order. So one of the first things that we suggest that folks do is, in step 1, is you determine your objectives and your scope. Now, this might be a good time to share a link in the chat. Let's see here. Where did it go? Okay, here's a link. If you want to follow along, as I go through these six steps, what the Tribal Climate Health Project has done is attempt to lift whatever burden of going through these steps off of you that we can. So I don't want you to feel super overwhelmed by all of this. This is going to be a high-level overview. you can also follow along in this website at any point in time, where we actually attach the resources that we think can help you along the process down these 6 steps. Okay, so what does it mean to determine objectives and scope? That means, what are you going to study and how are you going to do it? So first question I typically ask if I'm doing an adaptation planning process for a tribe is, all right, did we have any direction to do this work? Maybe you don't need it, but sometimes it's helpful to ask. If you're in the shadows doing a vulnerability assessment, and then you expect a tribal council to at some point adopt your vulnerability assessment and then go and invest in some adaptation strategies that result from it, you don't want to surprise them. You may want to have them bought in from the beginning. And in doing so, you can actually ask for some specific direction about what kinds of things they want to explore in a vulnerability assessment. And so these little plus signs here are where we're going to talk to you a little bit, if you go to that link I just sent, we have a resource there for you. This one actually comes from ITEP. So thank you to ITEP. They have a template resolution. So if you wanted to take a resolution to your council, say you got a grant and you want to take a resolution, say we're ready to do this vulnerability assessment, make sure your tribe is on board with what it is you're going to do. Use that template. It could be in that resolution or some other way. You're going to designate some lead staff. And I like to make the point here that whoever's in charge, their authority level does, in my experience, in looking across a lot of communities, it does matter, and the relationships matter. So for example, like Shasta, she's been around a long time at Paula and has a lot of credibility and has trust in the decision makers around her. And so she has a lot of ability to move forward on a lot of things. And I find that when that doesn't exist, whether it's a tribe or another agency, it's harder to move forward. So even if you are a person who maybe isn't at a high executive level, having that relationship with somebody who is at a high executive level to help shepherd and champion the steps through could be really helpful. And then sometimes it just matters about who has the resources to do it, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that, but then identifying potential roles. So it's like, who else around you should be part of this? Do I have consultants I'm going to work with? Do I have technical assistance coming from the outside or other stakeholders I want to involve? Do I have departments? And sometimes the relationships between the departments aren't always great, or maybe they are great and you want to make sure you can collaborate. Now is the time to get the departments on board who actually have a role in implementing adaptation strategies in the vulnerability assessment, because you're going to learn things from them that are on the ground realities that you may otherwise overlook. So say like your fire department, your public safety, your utilities, there's all sorts of different departments that you may want to start engaging now. They have a stake in what's going to happen. They have knowledge that is useful. And then you're going to you want them bought in now, because at some point they might have responsibility in implementing adaptation strategies. And then, looking at your resources, we could have a whole 2-day conversation about how you get resources to do this work. I know a lot of folks have gotten it from BIA Tribal Climate Resilience Programs. So we're really lucky that we have access to things like that. But say you have had a grant, are there grant requirements that you are required to follow? And if so, that's got to be factored into your scope of work. That might be the entire scope of work is determined by what you have a grant to do. So set parameters of the assessment. So that just means, what are you going to study? Looking at your time frame, how far out do you want to look? How soon do you want to get this done? We talk about things like, is it going to be an individual vulnerability assessment or a collaborative vulnerability assessment? That means, are multiple tribes going to work together to look at their vulnerabilities? There's trade-offs there. Could be really a good use of resources to look across multiple tribes in a region. But then there's the trade-off of, when you get down to actually identifying strategies and implementing them, you can't always do that in a collaboration, right? So you get down to where you actually have to make investments and commitments, and you might need your own adaptation plan to do that. But we've seen a lot of tribes do it collaboratively, and there's just, there's a lot of benefits to that too. And then you have to think about boundaries. So if you're one tribe and you just want to look at, maybe you have federal recognition, you want to look at your reservation lands, that's pretty straightforward. Like I said, I'm working with one tribe right now who wants to look at their ancestral lands. That's a little more complicated. It's a larger area. Or if you're working in a consortium of tribes, what does that boundary look like? So that's one of the first things to know is, what's our boundary? Because climate change, of course, impacts locations very differently. So when we look at data, we're going to look at the location, the specific boundary. And then we look at things like, are we going to look at everything in this vulnerability? So like all the things we've talked about so far today, all the different impacts, all the different exposures, are we looking at everything? Or do we just want to pick off something and go really deep on it? So that could look like, I only want to do a vulnerability assessment on heat, or I only want to do a vulnerability assessment that looks at health, or just on my natural environment. People have done this in all sorts of different ways. Or maybe I'm just looking at a climate vulnerability assessment for a critical facility. I tend, if I'm part of it, I like to advocate for a comprehensive, only because sometimes you only got one shot at this. And a lot of the data you're going to look at has, is helpful across a lot of different areas. So you get some economies of scale if you review data once and apply it to many different, assets or many different impact areas. But if you only have resources to do it one thing at a time, then do that. I like everything. We do as much as we can get done. Next slide. All right. So that's step one. If you're following along, I think the resource we had there was the ITEP resolution on the website. And then we also talk about the, I'll just go back for 1 second, which is here, the second plus sign. If you go to the website, we start talking to you about our exposures, impacts, and strategies inventory. That's where, if you have no idea, like say you were starting from scratch, you hadn't even been here today, what am I even supposed to potentially be looking at? Like, all right, I just got assigned to do a vulnerability assessment. What? You could go to the easy tool, and all you have to do is filter down. We're going to demo this whole thing tomorrow, but you would just filter down for your region, and it will at least give you like, what are your most concerning exposures, and what impacts might possibly be related to it. And it gives you an idea of like all the things you might look at.
I'm going to jump in here for a second, just because I see my friend and wise person, Miss Patty Dixon, squinting at the screen. Hi, Patty. And I promise you, we're going to make these slides available so you can zoom up and make them as big as you want.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I know, too many words. Squinting. Okay, so let's talk about steps 2 through 4, and I'm zooming through this. We would normally take longer to do it. This is a high level overview. But steps 2 through 4 are all mainly about collecting information. So to do a vulnerability assessment, so first you know what you're going to do, you determine your objectives and scope. Now you're going to engage the community, and you have so many ways to engage the community. And to do it really well, you probably need hundreds of thousands of dollars and some sort of academic on your side and like lots of consulting. I don't know. You could spend years just doing community engagement around this stuff. You probably don't have that time or resource. So it's how do you collect information as efficiently as you can with the amount of time and resource you have. We do recommend establishing a planning team. This is always part of when I do a vulnerability assessment. So that means which key departments and outside advisors are you going to involve in a core team of people that are going to be walking through all of the processes, and their role is typically advising on what's going to be included, advising on, are we getting the findings right? Do we really understand what the vulnerabilities? Do they have access to information we should be using? And then they're going to help us down the line brainstorm with adaptation strategies. And here we just say, don't forget health. So because we want health to be an important part, and maybe, we like to center the whole vulnerability assessment around health, make sure you're including health in that team if you can. So say you have somebody in your clinic that's really important, your IHS clinic, invite them. Okay, engage the community members. So that's a different kind of level. So we want some folks who are really core, and then we want to engage the community if we can. So that means you might have some steps that you want to take to gather perspectives from your community. So we have a little plus sign here. If you're following online, that means we have things like surveys. We've actually developed a template survey that you can access in order to capture information from your community. And it's in a Google form. It's free. And you could either use that and gather, just online survey responses for free, or you can use it and do interviews, or you can use it and do workshops. It really depends on what resource you have to do as much engagement as you can. And so you might think about, what elders can I engage? What youth groups can I engage? Am I going to go and do elder interviews? So it could be active. Active for us means I'm asking questions and getting perspectives back from my community. They're going to tell me what they care about, what they're concerned about. Or passive engagement, which just means at least you're going to tell the community what you're up to and what you're learning. So you're going to share information one way out. Shasta and Paula, they do both. They have a Paula Environmental Department website, and they do a great job of sharing all the stuff that we keep coming up with to inform their community, both about the planning process and about the risks and about whatever resources and actions that they're going to take. And so if you're following along on that website, we provide a link over to the PED website just so you can get an idea of how would you keep your community informed. So then we talk about the third step being, all right, we know what we're doing. We've begun to engage our community. We're going to continue engaging them. Now, what am I looking at? So how will I measure these potential vulnerabilities? What do I need to know to understand the risks coming to me? And so that plus sign takes you over to a link to that exposures, impacts, and strategies inventory. And we're going to demo it more tomorrow. But for today, I just want you to know it's an Excel-based tool that basically provides a full menu of all the ways that you could possibly measure all of those exposures and impacts that we've already talked about today. So if you're saying, wow, I wish I had a list of them all. Well, we have it. It's a long one, because if you imagine all of those 5 exposure areas then tied to which secondary exposures they're related to and tied to all the impacts that could come from it, that's the relational database that's in the easy tool. It also points you to ways to measure it. So the indicators meaning things like number of hospital visits for heat-related illness, number of times, per year that a power outage occurs, number of, your production rates for various crops, generally numbers, not always numbers. So, but those are the types of indicators. What can I measure so that I can understand the trends and risks? And then you go through a process of gathering and analyzing information. Now, this is where a lot of people really get stuck. So we put a lot of our energy behind this, because this fact-finding mission is another thing that could go on for years and years. And so our thought is, you're trying to find the best data to tell the story. Tell the story to who? Well, to your community eventually, and to your decision makers, because hopefully they're going to adopt something and then be committed to really doing something to protect from some of these adverse impacts of climate change. So meaningful information can be found all over the place. And I guess bad news is there is a lot of it. The good news is you have some of it already. And we recommend a braided approach, which just basically means take your internal information, so information that your tribes have, alongside some external information. And so internal information might look like your traditional knowledges. What do your traditional ecological knowledge records or elders, what do they know about the changes to each of these different climate exposures and what's been happening and what's changing? What other local observations have you collected if you did a survey, a workshop, or interviews? What other things does your community know about what's been changing? And then you've probably done some reports, things like a soil erosion study, an environmental study, a species study, other kinds of plans that you may have already conducted. Maybe you have a hazard mitigation plan. You can pull a lot of information from there. So you're sort of collecting what information you already have access to. And that's one of the first things I do when I work with a tribe is I say, dump, let's do a dump. We're going to collect everything you might have and see what we can, what information we can derive out of it, because we're going to not reinvent as much as we can avoid reinventing. Then we're going to go outside and we're going to look at what's publicly accessible information that we can use to to try to fill some of these blind spots, right? So we'll look for things like credible reports and studies. That might look like if your state has a climate assessment, we would look at that, or maybe there's one even more local, we'll look at that. The national, the federal government has a national climate assessment, we look at that. And then there are some organizations, and we're going to talk about this more tomorrow, that can provide free assistance here with us today that are on hand and really want to help you to actually do this fact-finding process. They will help you analyze, they'll help you collect and analyze data, interpret it, and use it. And that's pretty awesome. So you can just go to a human being and say, help. It's a little, I wish there was more of it, but there's some. And then a lot of what we did at the Tribal Climate Health Project was say, okay, oh my gosh, there's so many data sets out there, right? We've already kind of started telling you about some of the data and some of the charts and stuff that we've been showing you about all the various exposures and all the various impacts. We found that there was no way to convey all of that to you in a training. And so we began just squirreling it away. And that's back to that easy tool. So the exposures, impacts, and strategies inventory tool, right? It takes inventory of the exposures, the impacts, and it ties it up with the indicators that you might use to measure all those things, along with the actual data sources. So Serena Vega on my team, she's been working with me to try to build out the easy tools so that when you're ready to go, you can go into that tool and you can find the things that you can find the data that you need. If it exists, we are trying to put it in. Not all the data exists. That's the bad news. But this can take off, I don't know, a large percentage of the burden of you just starting from scratch, trying to find data in whatever and wherever you can find it. Where it's sort of an umbrella tool. So we're pointing you to all the different holders and makers of data, so that we're trying to point you to where we think the best ones are that can help you answer a lot of questions about your vulnerability. We'll get more into that tomorrow. So like I say here, there's both too many data sets and too many remaining gaps. But before I overwhelm you further, just back to this concept of we do the best we can. We're going to collect what we have capacity to collect and what's available to us and make the best decisions we can. No matter what, you're going to help your tribe more doing this vulnerability work, and however much you can do it, than by doing nothing, right? So when we talk about information, we'll talk about this more tomorrow, because we're going to dive more into data tomorrow. But it's really a function of so you're sort of measuring. It's a formula. You have exposure risk. How bad is wildfire coming to me? Plus the impact risk. How bad is the respiratory illness is going to be as a result of it? What are my community characteristics? Meaning, like, is my population especially sensitive, for example, to that smoke? Do I have a lot of elders with a lot of chronic illnesses? And do I have any adaptive capacity that lower? So population sensitivity would increase the risk. Adaptive capacity would lower the risk, meaning, all right, well, I do have some shelters in place. I have a collaborative agreement with some tribes around me to do collaborative emergency management and to help each other when there's a wildfire. Then we start really thinking about our strengths. What do we have that's already going to help us in these situations? So, you're moderating your risk up and down, but at the end of the day, the goal is to really understand which are your most, your highest priority vulnerabilities, because the idea is you have limited resources. So you're going to try to figure out what are the most urgent and significant needs for your community so that you can put your resources there. This is just an example of some of the internal information. So this is where you might get some information from surveys. You might get some information from GIS, right? So this comes from Paula's Transportation Adaptation Plan. This is something you can do in-house if you have access to GIS, and not all tribes do, but it's handy. So then this is what we'll talk about more tomorrow. This is a little mini snapshot of the easy tool. Like I said, if you're following along on that web page, you're going to be able to access it. You download it for free, super easy to download, and we'll work more on it tomorrow. All right, these are the last two steps, and then we're going to do our activity. The vulnerability assessments steps 5 and 6. So say, all right, we did our scope, we've engaged our community, we have gathered a bunch of information, both internally and externally, and we're analyzing it. Now you have to kind of make some sense of it. And that means prioritizing those vulnerabilities. So looking across, what did you learn about all these potential vulnerability areas? And there's a lot of different ways, like sort of an art around prioritizing, but whoever's part of your planning team or whoever else you want to engage in the decisions around what is most critical should be here to make these decisions. You basically determine high, medium, or low among all the potential vulnerabilities, so that you're trying to kind of rank them. You're ranking them. At the end of the day, then you're coming up with a list to say, these are my biggest vulnerabilities. And that's kind of the whole game here in a vulnerability assessment, is to have looked across at everything you can to say, all right, what are all my vulnerabilities? And now we are looking at which are my most significant. So where do I really, really need to put my time, energy, and resources so that I can protect from some of these vulnerabilities? We'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow too, when we get into the data and just evaluating data. But at the end of the day, all of this work gets synthesized into a report. And I put optional here because you don't have to necessarily even write a report. I've seen tribes do a video. I've seen tribes just do slides. I've seen tribes put the vulnerability assessment together with the adaptation plan and adopt them all in one report. But I personally like doing a vulnerability assessment on its own, because it says, all right, decision makers and community, here's our risks. So let's agree that these are the risks that we assume are the ones that are the biggest and most, the most significant to us. Once we all agree on that, then we're going to move into this next phase, right? That's the next phase, is the adaptation plan. So we're going to address all those things that we nailed down in the vulnerability assessment with real actions. And so our tips there are to incorporate visual stories and quotes to the extent possible. And then, of course, considering how to use and protect proprietary traditional knowledge and other information. So I run into this all the time, where we just don't include some things in a report if it all could be used publicly, or even I'm a consultant sometimes, so they don't share everything with me, and that is okay. So we're just going to include whatever information is not considered too sensitive to be included. Sometimes it's just back analysis. There's this lens over the final draft of whatever gets written to make sure that the tribe sensitive information is protected. And then you usually present it. Sometimes you take it to your tribal council. So that's a really high level view of what we think of as the 6 major steps of doing a vulnerability assessment. You could go all in and go do a lot. You could do each of these as just as much as you can if you don't have many resources, right? But this is generally the steps. If you're following along with that website that I shared with you, the resources that we have to share with you on this one is a Word version of Paula's vulnerability assessment. So we did it several years ago. It's written up, it's following this framework that we've been talking about all day. It's organized by those 5 exposure areas, and it's written to write up all of our findings on all the various impacts that we found, and then summarizes the most significant vulnerabilities that were, highest priority. So we give that to you, and that's shown right here. You have access to that. You can download the Word version of it, customize it for yourself. We don't care if you use that exact same format and document. You're going to want to use your own information, but for whatever citations and information still is relevant for you, we just say use it. So we're doing our best to try to lift off whatever burden we can off of this process, which we know, can seem overwhelming. Okay, so since we're talking about reports, the last thing I really want you all to do before we spend a little time taking care of ourselves today is to just choose one of these vulnerability assessments. And you're just going to spend a few minutes just scanning one of them. And I think we're going to, instead of doing the small groups, we're just going to let you spend 5 minutes reviewing one of these. Just scan it, see what's in there. And then we'll have a group conversation around these few questions. I just want to hear your thoughts on things like, what did you like or not like about it? What was surprising to you about the structure and flow? What types of information sources were referenced? And do you think it provided sufficient information to allow the tribe to consider adaptation strategies next? So that's what I want you to look for. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes to just review. I think folks are probably putting into the chat those links. Is that right?
Yes. Don't look at Paula as I can't take feedback. No, I'm kidding.
All right. Thank you, everybody. See you in 5.
I'm getting file not found for Puyallup.
Oh, you're right.
I know,
Right.
because I think the URL is missing. Instead of .pd, it should be .pdf. Let me try that again. Try that now. Yeah.
Yep, that was it. I just put the corrected one in the chat. Thanks for catching that.
Did I mess it up? Okay. All right, everybody. So it's not enough time to read a vulnerability assessment, but I'm just curious if anybody feels compelled to share a thought they had while they browsed quickly through a vulnerability assessment. Any of these prompts could help you. What did you like? What didn't you like?
I liked how beautiful they were. I mean, not everybody that reads these vulnerability assessments or approves them is going to be a scientist. And so having something that's pretty that people can relate to and that gives you a sense of place, I think is important.
Totally. Yeah. I really like the ones that have quotes in them too, because it personalizes it. It makes it more real. What else, everybody?
I agree. The Blackfeet climate change adaptation plan pulled a lot of the data into like pretty easy to read graphs in text boxes, or paired that information or the quotes with pictures. So as somebody who maybe isn't super familiar with the location or the people, it was really easy to visualize that information and understand.
That's right. That's the trick of all this. This is complicated stuff, and then we have to communicate it to people who've never heard about it before.
We have
What
a
else,
couple in
guys?
the chat too that Paula says she loved the Blackfeet plan. And so does Ryan. She says, remarks on that they are writing for understandability. And that I think is huge. You want this to be something that your tribal members will be able to read and understand. So you want to leave out the jargon and say, this is what you told us is going on. This is what we have verified is happening. And this is what we are doing. This is what we plan to do to deal with it.
Anybody else have any thoughts as they reviewed? Or take one last minute for it. That was a fast overview of vulnerability assessments. Don't be afraid. We have lots of resources to help, and we're going to be back tomorrow to dive deeper, like I said, on the data piece in particular.
Magdalena, did you have a question or comment?
Oh, I just really loved that there was the adaptation strategies, and like this notion of forward, right? I think that we always have to be forging a path forward, and we as communities always seem to have that element. And so moving into this final part of the day, I think being able to just lift that up, because to me that really encapsulates hope.
Such a good segue to this last slide, which is just a reminder that tribes are adapting to protect well-being despite what we know can be limited capacity and institutional barriers. This conference, we focus specifically on the vulnerability portion of this, knowing that there's a whole conference probably we could do around all the strategies to address the vulnerabilities, and that's probably what we should do next, but we wanted to really tackle this first piece here. We'll hear more about, I think, some strategies though tomorrow as well. So with that, I want to point people to the participant workbook, pages 21 and 22, where we are asking folks to do a little bit of reflection, because we will hope that at the end of this 2 days, you feel like you've gotten a little bit of a start on your vulnerability assessment process. When you go back home, you kind of feel a little bit more prepared to begin. And so take a couple minutes and fill that out. And then we have a short break. We're going to come back. Serena, tell us what time.